Here are the 5 most disturbing, unforgettable true crime stories ever discussed on the Joe Rogan Experience.
In episode 1459, investigative journalist Tom O'Neill pulled apart one of the most accepted stories in American crime history. What begins as a tale of cult madness slowly unravels into something colder, more deliberate, and far more disturbing. This isn't just about Charles Manson. It's about how a narrative was built and what may have been buried to make it stick.
For decades, the official explanation of the Manson murders felt almost too complete. A madman, high on delusion and prophecy, hears secret messages hidden in Beatles lyrics. He becomes convinced a race war is imminent. He sends his followers out into the night to slaughter strangers, believing the violence will ignite chaos, collapse society, and elevate him as a messianic survivor. It was shocking, grotesque, and simple enough to absorb. That simplicity was its greatest strength. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi called it helter-skelter, a theory so vivid it became gospel. According to the narrative, Charles Manson believed Black Americans would rise up, overthrow white society, and then be unable to govern the world they had won. At that moment, Manson and his followers would emerge from hiding in the desert, assume control, and rule over the survivors. The murders of wealthy white victims, staged to resemble attacks by Black militants, would spark the war. The logic was deranged but memorable, and a jury believed it. But Tom O'Neill didn't. When he first approached the case, he wasn't hunting conspiracies. He wasn't obsessed with Charles Manson. He hadn't even been particularly interested in the murders. He was a magazine journalist assigned a story, doing what journalists do, reading the book everyone else had read, helter-skelter, cover to cover. At first, it worked. The narrative was airtight. Every question seemed answered, every motive explained. Until it wasn't. The cracks didn't appear all at once. They surfaced in small, uncomfortable ways. Contradictions, timelines that didn't quite line up, testimony that felt too neat. And then there was the central problem, one so obvious it had somehow escaped scrutiny for years. Charles Manson was not physically present at the Tate house when the murders occurred. He didn't hold the knife. He didn't pull the trigger. He wasn't there. So how do you convict a man of murder when he never touched the victims? You do it with motive. Bugliosi's entire case depended on proving that Manson ordered the killings to fulfill his helter-skelter prophecy. Without that motive, the case collapses into something far murkier. Conspiracy charges demand clarity of intent. The story had to make sense, and the more O'Neill examined it, the more it felt like a story constructed backward from verdict to explanation. Bugliosi himself would later admit something astonishing. In interviews given quietly in the early 970 seconds interviews that went largely unnoticed, he acknowledged that he didn't believe Charles Manson truly believed helter-skelter. He thought Manson was a con man. Smart. Manipulative. Performative. Someone who sold beliefs he didn't personally hold. That admission changes everything. If Manson didn't believe in helter-skelter, then why send his followers to kill? If the prophecy was a lie, what was the real motive? That question haunted O'Neill, and it was never answered at trial. As he dug deeper, O'Neill began interviewing Bugliosi himself. The first meeting felt surreal. Bugliosi invited him into his Pasadena home. His wife served coffee and Italian cookies. They went out to lunch. They toured locations connected to the murders. For 6 hours, Bugliosi talked, and talked, and talked. Yet when the interview ended, O'Neill realized something unsettling. He had learned nothing new. Everything Bugliosi said was already in helter-skelter. It was polished, rehearsed, immutable. So O'Neill tried a last resort, the journalistic Hail Mary. He asked if there was anything Bugliosi could share off the record, something that might lead somewhere new. Bugliosi paused. Then he said, "Turn it off." What he revealed would send O'Neill down a rabbit hole he would spend the next 20 years trying to climb out of. The revelation involved a piece of evidence that had always been treated as trivial. A videotape found in the Tate house shortly after the murders. According to the official story, police discovered the tape, viewed it, saw nothing more than Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate engaged in consensual sex, and returned it without concern. Bugliosi told O'Neill something very different. The tape, he said, did not show consensual sex. It showed Sharon Tate being assaulted by two men while Roman Polanski watched and directed. You could hear Polanski's voice in the background. If true, that detail detonates the entire moral framing of the case. It reframes the environment surrounding the victims. It introduces new power dynamics. And it suggests that evidence was quietly neutralized, not because it was irrelevant but because it was inconvenient. Years later, when Bugliosi threatened O'Neill with lawsuits and attempted to block publication of his work, he put this same information in writing. By doing so, he inadvertently stripped it of its off-the-record protection. What had once been whispered was now documented. And that was only the beginning. As O'Neill continued investigating, he discovered documented perjury by key witnesses, perjury that went unchallenged in court. Terry Melcher, a music producer and former resident of the Tate House, had testified that his relationship with Manson ended months before the murders. He claimed he had no contact with Manson afterward and no reason to fear him. But O'Neill found records proving otherwise. Melcher had visited Manson after the murders. Multiple times, he had gone to Spawn Ranch. He had even traveled out to Death Valley, where the Manson family was hiding at Barker Ranch. These weren't rumors. They were documented visits. Melcher was crucial to the prosecution's motive. Bugliosi argued that Manson targeted the Tate House because Melcher had once lived there and had rejected Manson's musical ambitions. Revenge, layered on top of Helter Skelter, became the emotional engine of the case. But if Melcher was still interacting with Manson after the murders, that motive disintegrates. Why would a man terrified for his life voluntarily seek out the person who allegedly ordered mass murder because of him? It didn't make sense. And it wasn't just Melcher. Other witnesses lied. Greg Jacobson, Rudy Altobelli. Stories were reshaped to fit a narrative that had already been decided. No one challenged it because no one wanted to. The country was horrified. The spectacle of the trial, Manson and his followers, singing, chanting, carving symbols into their faces, captured all attention. The theater eclipsed the evidence. Meanwhile, something else was happening outside the courtroom. The cultural impact of the murders was immediate and profound. When the Manson family was arrested, the headlines exploded. Photos of barefoot hippie women, holding children, accused of savage murder, ran on front pages worldwide. The message was unmistakable. This is where the counterculture leads. LSD, free love, communal living, it all ends in blood. That message aligned perfectly with something else unfolding at the same time, COINTELPRO. The FBI's counterintelligence program was designed to neutralize political movements deemed threatening to the status quo. The Black Panthers were a primary target. So was the broader youth movement. Internal memos revealed strategies to sow fear, fracture alliances, and turn the public against activists. One memo suggested targeting wealthy white supporters of the Panthers, Hollywood elites who donated money and visibility, make them afraid, make them believe that revolution would not spare them. The Tate House wasn't just a residence, it was a social hub, a crossroads of music, film, and celebrity. Sharon Tate, Roman Polanski, Terry Melcher, Candice Bergen, the house symbolized elite Hollywood liberalism. If terror struck there, it would echo everywhere. After the murders, it did. As writer Joan Didion later observed, many people felt the same thing that summer. The 1,960 seconds were over. The optimism collapsed, trust dissolved. The counterculture became something parents feared instead of admired. Whether by design or coincidence, the Manson murders achieved exactly what COINTELPRO aimed for. The hippie became the monster, the revolution became a nightmare, and the state emerged as the only force capable of restoring order. When O'Neill confronted Bugliosi years later with these findings, the response was not reasoned rebuttal. It was rage, screaming, threats, lawsuits, letters to publishers, attempts to discredit, intimidate, and silence. A man confident in his truth does not behave that way. Bugliosi's letters grew increasingly erratic. Dozens of pages. Contradictions. rambling arguments. Even the publisher's lawyers were stunned. One asked a simple question: was Bugliosi mentally impaired? O'Neill didn't think so. He thought Bugliosi knew exactly what he was doing, and why. Because if the official motive was false, if Helter Skelter was a convenient myth, then the real story was far more dangerous. Not madness, manipulation, not chaos, control. The murders didn't just kill people, they killed a moment in American history. And once you see that, you can't unsee it.
The story we were told explained everything too cleanly, but history rarely works that way. When a narrative fits perfectly, it's often because the rough edges were sanded down. And sometimes, the most unsettling truth isn't what Charles Manson believed, but who benefited from the story we were made to believe. In episode 1714, Joe Rogan sat with Josh Dubin and Robert Jones to unravel a case that exposes the quiet mechanics of injustice. What begins as a crime spree in New Orleans slowly transforms into a story about missing evidence, manufactured guilt, and a system more committed to winning than to truth. This is not a story about one mistake, it's about what happens when the truth is no longer convenient.
The crimes were terrifying on their own. A series of violent acts unfolding in the French Quarter of New Orleans, armed robberies, a rape, a kidnapping, and ultimately, a murder. To the public, it looked like a spree, a single thread connecting chaos, violence, and fear. Law enforcement framed it that way almost immediately. One car, one string of crimes, one narrative. And then there was a name. Robert Jones didn't know it yet, but an anonymous tip had quietly redirected the weight of an entire investigation onto his life. He wasn't caught at a crime scene. He wasn't identified by witnesses. His fingerprints weren't found on weapons. His DNA wasn't recovered from victims. But his name surfaced, and in the machinery of prosecution, that was enough to start the gears turning. Police needed a suspect, prosecutors needed a story, and Robert Jones became the connective tissue that made their theory work. The state claimed he was tied to the car used in the crimes. That car became the backbone of the case, the supposed bridge between Robert and the violence. But when you strip the story down to evidence, the foundation dissolves. There was no registration tying him to the vehicle, no insurance records, no driver's license recovered, no eyewitnesses placing him inside, no surveillance footage, nothing tangible. What they had was a word. Another man already under suspicion, already desperate, told prosecutors that Robert was his friend, that he had let Robert use the car, that they were together, that was it. One statement from a man facing his own legal annihilation, a man with every incentive to redirect blame, and the state accepted it without question. Years later, the truth emerged in fragments, buried beneath layers of withheld evidence. Another suspect was arrested for the murder itself. Not only arrested, convicted. And when he was taken into custody, police found something extraordinary in his possession: jewelry belonging to robbery victims, clothing tied to the rape. Items directly connected to multiple crimes in the so-called spree. Physical evidence, real evidence. But none of it was turned over to Robert's defense. Even more damning, the convicted murderer told prosecutors something critical. He said Robert had nothing to do with any of it, that they weren't friends, that Robert never used the car, that Robert wasn't involved at all. That statement, clear, direct, exculpatory, was hidden. At Robert's trial, the prosecutor told a completely different story. They argued the two men were close, that they acted together, that Robert had access to the car, that he was part of the spree. The jury never heard the truth, because the truth never made it into the courtroom. This wasn't an oversight, it was a choice. Robert was convicted. Even after that conviction, the state kept pushing. He was still charged with the murder despite the fact that someone else had already been convicted for it. It sounds impossible. It sounds like something the law shouldn't allow. But there was a doctrine that made it legal. The felony murder rule. Under this rule, if two people are committing a felony together and someone dies in the process, both are responsible for the murder regardless of who pulled the trigger. It doesn't matter if you were present at the killing, it doesn't matter if you knew what would happen. If the state claims you were part of the underlying crime, you share the guilt. So the prosecution leaned into the theory. Robert and the other man were supposedly partners, friends, accomplices, a team, even though there was no proof they had ever met. While Robert sat in jail, facing life sentences for rape, kidnapping, and armed robbery, the district attorney made a move. On the day of sentencing, an offer was presented. 21 years for manslaughter, a deal, a way out. Robert was terrified. He had already been convicted. Life sentences loomed over him like a shadow that never moved. He didn't confess. He didn't admit guilt. But he took the deal because fear makes people do things that justice never should. That plea didn't make him guilty. It made him trapped. Only later did the full scope of what had been hidden come into focus. Reports documenting inconsistent witness statements, evidence pointing back to the actual perpetrator. Records showing that the state's key witness, the man who accused Robert, had recanted his story before trial. All of it suppressed. This pattern isn't rare, it's structural. When prosecutors commit to a theory, they rarely abandon it. Evidence that contradicts the narrative doesn't trigger reevaluation, it triggers rationalization. The system doesn't ask, "Were we wrong?" It asks, "How do we explain this away?" Confessions by real killers are dismissed as guilt or confusion. Recantations are reframed as manipulation. Missing evidence becomes irrelevant. The goal quietly shifts from justice to preservation of reputations, convictions, careers. Josh Dubin has seen this cycle repeat itself across the country. In case after case, prosecutors and judges protect outcomes rather than truth. Once a verdict is rendered, the system hardens. Admitting error becomes a threat not just to one case, but to the legitimacy of the institution itself. It becomes a game, not a joke but a competition. Win or lose. And when winning becomes the objective, empathy disappears. Corners get cut, evidence gets buried, people become collateral damage. Police quotas reinforce it. Arrest numbers, ticket counts, clearance rates, metrics that turn human lives into statistics. When performance is measured by numbers, justice becomes secondary. Robert Jones wasn't unlucky, he was processed. His case reveals a deeper flaw, not just corruption, but human rigidity. Once people decide they are right, especially intelligent, powerful people, changing course becomes nearly impossible. Flexibility disappears, doubt is treated as weakness, and anyone who challenges the narrative becomes the enemy. This is how wrongful convictions survive appeals. This is how evidence stays hidden for decades. This is how innocent people lose years of their lives not because the truth wasn't known, but because it wasn't convenient. And when empathy dies inside a system, something darker replaces it. Efficiency, indifference, sociopathy masked as procedure. Robert's story is not an anomaly. It's a warning. Because when the system decides you're guilty, the truth becomes optional.
Robert Jones didn't lose his freedom because of evidence, he lost it because of a story the system refused to abandon. When winning matters more than being right, innocence becomes expendable. And once that line is crossed, anyone can be taken. In episode 1858, Joe Rogan listened as Derek Hamilton described a life repeatedly erased by the justice system. What begins with a teenage arrest in 1,980 seconds, Brooklyn turns into a decades-long battle against manufactured testimony, coerced witnesses, and a detective who never stopped rewriting the truth. This is not just a wrongful conviction story, it's what happens when innocence refuses to disappear quietly.
Derek Hamilton was 17 years old when the system first decided who he was going to be. Brooklyn, in the early 1,980 seconds, was unforgiving. Crime was high, poverty was everywhere, and policing was aggressive by design. Derek was a kid running the streets, doing what kids in those neighborhoods often did: petty robberies, adolescent mistakes, the kind of behavior that drew attention long before it justified a prison cell. The police knew his face. They stopped him regularly, threw him against cars, pat-downs, searches, routine humiliation disguised as order. Then, one morning around 5 a.m., a man was shot and killed by older men in the neighborhood. Within hours, police identified a car believed to be connected to the crime. The owner of that car was brought in, and somehow, despite every instinct that should have stopped it, the man told police he had lent the car to a 17-year-old kid. He claimed Derek Hamilton brought it back and confessed to shooting someone by accident. That single statement detonated Derek's life. No one questioned the logic. No one asked why a grown man would hand his car to a teenager. No one asked why there was no physical evidence tying Derek to the shooting, no forensic proof, no eyewitness placing him at the scene, just a story and the system's willingness to accept it. Derek was arrested, charged with murder, convicted. At trial, something extraordinary happened. A witness came forward and told the court the truth. She said she had never seen Derek at the crime scene. She said police forced her to lie before the grand jury. She refused to testify again. She refused to commit perjury. The judge initially did the right thing. He told the prosecutor that without another witness, the case would be dismissed. That should have been the end. Instead, the next day, the judge reversed himself. After thinking about it all night, he ruled that the only person who benefited from the witness refusing to testify was Derek Hamilton. And so, in a move that shredded the Sixth Amendment, he allowed the prosecution to introduce the witness's grand jury testimony as evidence despite the fact that she had recanted it, and despite Derek losing his right to confront her in court. The jury never saw the truth. They heard a ghost version of a lie. Derek was sentenced to 25 years to life. In that moment, something inside him hardened not into bitterness, but into resolve. He knew the system had no intention of saving him, so he decided to save himself. New York State prisons had law libraries, not out of mercy but out of obligation. Derek lived there. He studied constitutional law, case precedent, appellate procedure. He taught himself how the machinery that crushed him actually worked. 6.5 years later, the appellate division ruled what should have been obvious from the beginning. There was no evidence Derek had intimidated the witness. No justification for stripping his right to confrontation. His conviction was reversed. He walked out of prison believing the nightmare was over. 8 months later, it started again. A detective named Louis Scarcella decided Derek hadn't done enough time. Scarcella wasn't part of the original appeal. He wasn't assigned to Derek's case anymore, but he carried a grudge and a badge. Derek was living in New Haven, Connecticut, running a small clothing business when Scarcella walked into the store and arrested him. Another murder. Same city. Same detective. This time, the prosecution produced a witness named Jewel Smith. She told the jury she had been present when her boyfriend was murdered. She said Derek was the gunman. She said she watched him fire multiple shots. The jury never heard what she told police first. Her original statement said she wasn't there at all. She said she was around the corner at a store. She said she came back to find her boyfriend already dead. That statement was buried. Ballistics evidence contradicted her testimony. The victim had been shot with 2 different guns. The shooting didn't happen where she claimed. None of it mattered. Derek was convicted again, another 25 years to life. Only after the verdict did the truth surface. Under oath, Jewel Smith admitted she lied because Detective Scarcella threatened her. She was on parole. She had children. She was told she would go to jail if she didn't testify the way he wanted. What was I supposed to do, she asked. A judge ordered hearings. Over and over, judges admitted they were troubled. Over and over, prosecutors argued Derek was a bad guy. Over and over, relief was denied. Years turned into decades. Derek filed motion after motion. Each time, the evidence grew stronger. Alibi witnesses. Police officers from Connecticut who could place him at a party hundreds of miles away. A real perpetrator who was present when police arrived and conveniently ignored. A 911 caller describing 3 men fleeing in a red car, none of them Derek. The courts threw it away. Then came parole. The board demanded a confession. Admit guilt and go home sooner. Derek refused. He would not trade truth for freedom. He fought them for 2 years. His family protested. The press got involved. A daily news article reframed the case. The parole board finally looked at the evidence instead of the conviction. They released him. Freedom didn't end the story, it started a crusade. Inside prison, Derek had helped form an actual innocence team. Men who lived in law libraries because innocence has no recreational hours. When he got out, he joined families and friends of the wrongfully convicted. They protested, they exposed prosecutors, they forced elections. A new district attorney reopened cases. 22 convictions unraveled. A pattern emerged, one name appearing again and again. Louis Scarcella. Over 200 cases. At least 20 confirmed exonerations. No punishment. Full pension. 2 lawyers standing beside him every time he testified. Selective memory. Total protection. In 2014, a historic ruling changed New York law. Courts could no longer dismiss innocence claims on procedural technicalities. They had to answer one question: is this person innocent or not? Derek Hamilton was exonerated in 2015. His life had been taken twice, and he gave what remained of it back to the fight because he knew how many others were still inside, studying law in silence, waiting for the system to finally listen.
Derek Hamilton wasn't broken by prison, he was sharpened by it. Framed, erased, and silenced, he turned survival into resistance. And his story leaves one question behind: how many others are still locked away, not because they're guilty, but because the system refuses to admit it was wrong? In episode 1947, a casual conversation veered into something far darker. What began as speculation about a modern murder case opened a door into a deeper question: how evil moves unnoticed, how killers blend in, and how often the truth is fragmented across multiple lives. This is a story about intuition, patterns, and the moments when darkness almost reveals itself.
Some stories don't begin with blood. They begin with a feeling. A moment of unease. A look in someone's eyes. A sensation so subtle it's easy to dismiss until years later, when the truth surfaces and rewrites everything you thought you experienced. The conversation drifted, as it often does, from culture to crime. A suspect accused of brutally murdering college students in Idaho. A man described as intelligent, methodical, possibly studying criminology not to stop violence, but to perfect it. A figure so unsettling that even the idea of his execution sparked debate. The possibility that his crimes extended beyond one state, beyond one moment, suggested something far worse than a single act of violence. It suggested a pattern. And patterns are what link monsters together. History has taught us that serial killers rarely arrive fully formed in the public eye. They exist quietly first. They date, they work, they attend school. They sit across from people at restaurants, smiling politely, while something inside them calculates. Chris DiStefano shared a story passed down through his family, one that captures this truth with chilling clarity. His mother once had a close friend who, as a young woman, went on a date in Utah. Nothing about it seemed unusual. They met casually, sat down to eat, talked. But as the evening unfolded, she felt something shift. Looking across the table, she noticed a vacancy in the man's eyes. Not emptiness, something worse. An absence of humanity. A predatory stillness. It frightened her enough to break social convention. She excused herself, went to a payphone, and called her brother. She asked him to come immediately. She hid in the bathroom until he arrived. When she left, she didn't look back. That fear saved her life. The next morning, her brother, working an early paper route, noticed movement outside their home. Someone hiding in the bushes, a man fleeing when spotted. Later, when he described the jacket the man wore, the sister froze. It matched the man from the date. Years passed. Life moved on. Then, one night, she saw a face on the news. Ted Bundy. She nearly collapsed. Bundy was already killing at the time of their date, though the world didn't know it yet. When she saw his face again, she recognized the look, the one no photograph could capture. A transformation that occurred when he selected a victim. His features hardened, his expression shifted. What people later described as handsome vanished, replaced by something predatory and calculating. She realized then what her instincts had detected. She hadn't just been uncomfortable. She had been targeted. That realization that intuition can sense danger before the mind understands it echoes across countless survivor stories. Bundy wasn't unique in that way. Many killers radiate a presence when they believe no one is watching closely enough. But not all evil announces itself through intuition. Sometimes it hides behind confessions. The son of Sam terrorized New York City in the 1,970 seconds. His crimes felt random, chaotic, senseless. When David Berkowitz was arrested, the city exhaled. The nightmare had a face, a name, a cell. But years later, people who had lived alongside him in prison began to whisper something different. That he hadn't acted alone, that there were others, that a cult may have been involved. That the city, desperate for closure, accepted a single villain instead of chasing a complicated truth. Decades later, documentaries would echo those suspicions. The possibility that Berkowitz was responsible for only some of the killings reopened a wound New York thought had healed. Then there was Henry Lee Lucas. Lucas confessed to hundreds of murders across the United States. Hundreds. He became one of the most prolific killers in American history on paper. Law enforcement celebrated the confessions. Cold cases closed overnight. Families were told they finally had answers. But the timeline didn't work. Lucas couldn't have been in all those places. Some murders occurred when he was verifiably elsewhere. Others contradicted basic forensic facts. Yet his confessions were accepted because they were convenient. He was a drifter, a known killer, a perfect container for unresolved violence. Later investigations revealed a disturbing possibility. Lucas had been fed details, encouraged, guided. His confessions weren't evidence, they were shortcuts. This pattern repeats itself across history. When the system wants resolution, it sometimes prefers a willing liar to an uncomfortable truth. Serial killers who exaggerate, police who close cases, cities that move on. Even modern cases reflect this same tension. The Idaho murders reignited public fear because they felt calculated, clinical, as if someone had studied violence academically before committing it practically. The idea that the suspect might be connected to other unsolved cases created a familiar anxiety. How many times have we already seen this before the pattern was recognized? The public wants certainty. Law enforcement wants closure. But certainty is rare, and closure is often artificial. Stories like Bundy's date, Berkowitz's cult rumors, Lucas's confessions, and countless others reveal something unsettling. Evil isn't always obvious. It doesn't always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it sits quietly across the table, sometimes it volunteers answers, sometimes it becomes famous while hiding the truth. And sometimes, the system itself becomes complicit not by intent, but by exhaustion. We want monsters to look like monsters. We want guilt to be clear. We want stories that end cleanly. But reality resists that structure. Real evil is patient. It adapts. It blends in. It survives on our need for simplicity. The most frightening part isn't that killers exist. It's how often they almost don't get caught, and how often we mistake resolution for justice.
Some dangers announce themselves, others whisper. They sit across from you, smile politely, and wait. And by the time the truth surfaces through news reports, confessions, or history, it's already too late. Because the scariest monsters aren't the ones we recognize, but the ones we almost miss. In episode 150 of the JRE MMA show, a casual conversation about nostalgia took a sudden, chilling turn. What started with memories of old television uncovered a darker truth about a time when monsters could move freely, unseen, and even smile into a camera. This is a story about an era before tracking, before DNA, before warning signs were taken seriously.
There was a time when television felt permanent. You couldn't pause it, you couldn't rewind it, you couldn't escape it. When the screen went to commercial, you watched the commercial. When the show came back, you were still there. The world moved at the speed of broadcast, not demand. That slowness shaped everything, including how danger moved through society. In the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, there was no internet, no cell phones, no GPS, no instant alerts. A person could disappear between towns and leave behind nothing but questions. And the people most exposed to that uncertainty were women, traveling alone in a country that hadn't yet learned how to see predators hiding in plain sight. That's what makes the story so disturbing. Not just the violence, but how easily it blended into normal life. One night, watching an old episode of 20 over 20, a familiar chill resurfaced. The episode was about a man known as the dating game killer. A serial killer who, at the height of his crimes, walked onto a brightly lit television set, cracked jokes, smiled at the audience, and competed for a date while multiple victims were already buried because of him. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was on national television. Rodney Alcala had already killed when he appeared on the dating game in 1978. How many? No one could say for certain at the time. What mattered was that he had taken lives and then casually sat beneath studio lights, joking with a woman who would later say she felt something deeply wrong about him. Viewers laughed. The audience clapped. America watched. This wasn't incompetence, it was the reality of the era. Back then, predators could move across state lines without leaving digital footprints. They could change names, jobs, cities. Police departments didn't share databases. DNA analysis was decades away. Even missing persons cases often went cold simply because there was no way to connect dots spread across hundreds of miles. One of Alcala's victims illustrated that perfectly. A young woman traveling with her boyfriend went to Montana. They argued. He left her stranded, alone, vulnerable. Alcala picked her up. She vanished. Her body wasn't found until the year 2000. Decades later, investigators discovered she had been pregnant when she was killed. That detail alone reframes the horror, not just a murder but a life erased before it had even begun. And yet, during this same window of time, Alcala was charming audiences, flirting on camera, being called the banana on a light-hearted dating show. The contrast is almost unbearable. People sometimes ask how this could happen. The real question is simpler: how could it not? In a world without digital surveillance, predators relied on anonymity, and they were rewarded for it. Alcala wasn't an exception. He was part of a pattern. Chris DiStefano shared a story that captures this truth with unsettling clarity. A story passed through his family not from police files, but from lived memory. His mother had a friend who, as a young woman, went on a date in Utah. Nothing unusual, no red flags anyone could explain, but something felt wrong. Sitting across the table, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She couldn't articulate it, she just knew. She excused herself, went to a payphone, and called her brother. She asked him to come immediately. She hid in the bathroom until he arrived. She never went back to the table. The next morning, her brother, working an early paper route, noticed movement outside their house. Someone hiding in the bushes. When the figure ran, he caught a glimpse of the jacket. Later, when he described it, his sister froze. It was the same man. Years later, when Ted Bundy's face appeared on the news, she recognized him instantly. Not because of his looks, but because of what she'd seen in his eyes that night. Survivors would later describe it the same way. Bundy's face changed when he was hunting. Something shifted, something predatory surfaced. That instinct, the ability to sense danger before logic catches up, saved her life. But instincts don't always get listened to, and confessions don't always mean truth. The son of Sam terrified New York City. When David Berkowitz was arrested, the city wanted relief more than answers. One killer, one explanation, case closed. But whispers followed. Prison inmates, investigators, journalists, claims that Berkowitz hadn't acted alone, that a cult had been involved, that some murders attributed to him didn't match his movements. Years later, documentaries would reopen those questions, not to excuse his crimes, but to ask whether the full truth had ever been pursued. Then there was Henry Lee Lucas. Lucas confessed to hundreds of murders. Hundreds. Police departments across the country cleared cold cases overnight. Families were given closure. The system congratulated itself. Except the timelines didn't work. Lucas couldn't have been in all those places. Some crimes happened while he was provably elsewhere. Details in his confessions matched police theories too neatly, as if he'd been fed information rather than recalling it. Eventually, investigators realized something terrifying. Lucas wasn't just confessing he was being used. His willingness to admit guilt made him the perfect dumping ground for unresolved violence. A living archive of crimes that no one wanted to keep open. This wasn't justice. It was convenience. And that's the pattern that keeps resurfacing. When the public demands answers, the system sometimes provides resolution instead of truth. A single face for collective fear. A name to absorb countless unanswered questions. Whether it's Alcala smiling on television, Bundy blending into society, Berkowitz becoming a symbol, or Lucas confessing to crimes he couldn't have committed, the outcome is the same. The story becomes simpler. And simplicity feels safe. Even today, the fear hasn't vanished. Modern cases like the Idaho student murders rekindle that same anxiety. A suspect accused of methodical, calculated violence, studying criminology, possibly linked to other unsolved cases. The idea that someone could still operate unseen in an age of cameras, DNA, and data tracking feels impossible. But it isn't. Technology only works when someone is looking. Patterns only emerge when someone connects them. And evil doesn't need to be loud, it just needs opportunity. The most unsettling part of these stories isn't the violence itself. It's how normal everything looked beforehand. Game shows, dates, smiles, conversations, television audiences laughing at jokes, unaware they were applauding someone who had already crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. The past wasn't safer. It was quieter. And in that silence, monsters didn't hide. They performed.
Before DNA, before tracking, before the world learned how to watch itself, killers didn't need to hide. They dated, they joked, they went on television. And by the time the truth caught up, the damage was already done, leaving behind one question that still lingers today. How many were missed because no one was looking yet?